Well, thank you everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Good morning and good afternoon. We're really glad to have you here today to join us with Using Turning Point for Fun and Results webinar. My name is Kaleena Miller. I'm the program coordinator for the Energy program of NCAT, and I'm joined by Conrad, the Northeast Regional Director of NCAT. Before I let Norm introduce himself and start the webinar, I just have a few quick housekeeping items. Those of you on the call for a while have heard them already, but just a reminder, everyone do not have yourself on speakerphone. The two exceptions are the two offices here in Butte and in Fayetteville who have multiple people in the same room. Keep yourself on speakerphone, but just make sure you're muted. And that goes for everyone. So everyone make sure that you are muted unless you're going to speak towards the end of this webinar, or else we're going to get a lot of feedback here. We don't want to hear people coughing, sneezing, and cell phones ringing. The last thing I'm going to say at the beginning of this webinar is if you do have questions or comments as Norm and I go through the presentation, there's a chat box feature that you should see in your webinar window in the GoToWebinar. It should be at the very bottom. If you expand it, you can actually type in a message, and we'll be monitoring that throughout the webinar. If it's urgent, we might address it. Otherwise, we're going to hold it, and at the end of our slides, we'll have a formal Q&A session where everyone can unmute themselves if they have a question or comment, and then we can talk more about Turning Point and how everyone feels about it. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Norm to get us started.
Good morning, everybody. This is Norm coming to the other side of the country. If we advanced our first slide here, I'm just going to give you a brief outline of what we're going to cover today. Turning Point is a brand name, and the technology really is called what we call audience response. And Turning Point is really software and some hardware that's been developed. The slide that we had up in the introduction that Kaleena had showed something that's called conventionally everybody calls a clicker. They're called response cards in the trade, and a receiver unit. And what this does, it essentially turns your laptop when you're out doing a presentation into a two-way communications model, because the audience, now you pose questions and they respond to it. And we're going to briefly explain how you go about creating Turning Point slides. And if you can work with PowerPoint, you have all the skill sets that are involved with being able to ask those questions then and turning it into a Turning Point presentation. We'll go over the different types of questions that are out there. We will look at additional features, some things you can do with Turning Point, some of the little buttons and gizmos, such as gaming theory, things like that. Then it really gets down to the crux of the whole thing is reporting, saving your data, because it turns all these results into Excel format. So everything the audience has responded to you on, whether it's demographics, whether you're asking subject matter questions, their knowledge, their present practices, whatever that may be, it's all saved into Excel now, and you can save that data, and now you don't have to go back and do a lot of adding and subtracting and doing a bunch of questionnaires or evaluations. Kaleena's going to talk a little bit toward the end about what we call anywhere polling. So if you're somebody that really isn't a big fan of PowerPoint, some of the other platforms like Moodle or some of the other ones that are out there that some folks are using, there's also a response system that works with that. We're going to talk about who should use it, and then we're finally going to end up with some additional resources. So if we can go to the next slide, please. The audience response system, and the graphic shows it here, this might look like a typical PowerPoint presentation. If we go ahead and click on this, you'll see it's something that's called Agile Learning. And Agile Teaching. And what it really means is, for you, the teacher, the instructor that's out there, it tells you right away, did my audience get what I was trying to explain to them? This is not a new technology, and let's start off with that. It's been around since about 2005, and one of the people that helped innovate or develop this was a physics professor at Harvard called Eric Mazur. And Eric was tasked with teaching basic physics to biology and pre-med students at Harvard. And the problem was he would try to explain concepts 5 or 10 minutes long, and he'd ask questions of the students, and they would not get it. And so finally, Eric one day, just in frustration, said, "Why don't you talk to each other?" And he walked out of the room. He was really frustrated with the concept. And he walked back in about 2 minutes later, and the entire lecture hall had gotten it because they turned to the people sitting next to them and discussed it. And he said, "This really is peer teaching, and I've got to be a little bit better about this." And oftentimes, when we talk about that, if we click again, you get instant feedback as a teacher, because especially if you're the speaker that's after lunch, everybody's had a big meal, their eyes are kind of glazed over. You can tell because now you've ramped it up a bit. So let's go to the next slide a little. And one of the ways this happens is people learn by a number of different ways. This is actually called Dale's cone of experience, and if you're a pedagogue, somebody who's done a lot of teaching or had a lot of educational theory over time, one of the things we know is that people that either sit in a lecture hall or just read something out of a book or a publication or a pamphlet or something like that retain 5 to 10% of what they read or what they hear. And that's and there's a lot of educational testing that's gone behind this, and that retention period is a 2-week period. Everybody that does research in this area of retention, when they work with Dale's cone of experience, they look at, how much do they recall after 2 weeks. And one of the things we do is we take it out of that passive method. Even if you do audio-visual, which is, watching a video or maybe watching a screen, that still is passive. Once you start interacting with content, you take it to the active phase, and that's really what Turning Point and audience response systems do. The lecture was developed in the 1300s at Oxford University in England, and most lecture halls are kind of, facing one way down toward the speaker, and, he's effusing all this knowledge outward. What Turning Point and some of these technologies do is they make it a two-way street. You're now providing feedback, and the audience, you can kind of gauge, did they get what I was asking or not? Did they know this concept? And we're going to get to those probing questions a little bit. But it becomes interactive. It becomes a two-way dialogue between you, the presenter, and the audience that's out there. And it really becomes cognitive learning. So if we go to the next slide, we can ask questions on content. Okay, we can ask questions about, what is the audience's current practices? Are they saving energy? If it's food core, are they preserving food? Are the producers using a high tunnel? Are they extending their growing seasons? So you can ask questions on subject matter content you're teaching, but you can also get questions about the audience's current practices, maybe a little bit about their demographics, and we're going to go through some of those questions. The other nice thing is, oftentimes in an audience, if you've spoken to them in a group, there may be 1 or 2 people in the audience that are out there that really feel strongly about something. And when you do ask a question, they jump up and dominate the discussion. I've seen that happen so many times. Especially, I kind of call it the town meeting format, or the town hall approach, is that you got somebody that, he thinks everybody ought to agree with them, and he's going to dominate the discussion. The nice thing that Turning Point technology does is everybody gets to play. Is the way I discuss it, is everybody's opinion counts. They click in with an answer, okay? And if we click again, the silent participants are involved with it, and all of a sudden now they become engaged. And so we capture all those minority opinions, or the people that usually don't chime in on a discussion point. Let's go to the next slide. You can see Turning Point is really just one manufacturer. There are several other ones out there. It's a brand name. And essentially, if you can do PowerPoint or some of the other technologies, there is an audience response system or a vehicle that works for you. Like I said, there's about 6 million of these units have been sold in about the last 9 or 10 years. So it's out there in quite big numbers. A lot of it is used in traditional educational format, but there's other vehicles that are there too. And what it does, the nice thing about this, it makes it seamless. You're going to spend some time up front in crafting questions or, refining kind of what you want your audience to learn. But the power is really in the back because you really recapture all the numbers that are out there. You recapture the facts, what the audience learned, what they know, and what they're going away with. And since we've talked about being interactive, at this point I'm going to turn it over to Kaleena, and she's going to pose some questions to you, the audience, because one of the first things they always tell us is get to know your audience a little bit. So go ahead, Kaleena.
Great, thanks, Norm. So all of you were sent a few questions a couple weeks ago regarding your use of PowerPoint, what stakeholders you present to, and a few other items. We're going to start out today with 3 quick questions just to see who's on this call and refresh our memory as presenters as to who we're talking to today. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the first question. Okay, so everyone should see that question pop up. So why don't you go ahead and answer. And for those of you in a room with multiple people, I'll ask you to use the chat box feature to just enter additional answers. So whoever's closest to the computer, just select your answer, and we'll see that people are starting to answer. We've got 20% of the votes in. And so far, no one has said they don't use PowerPoint. That's good. A couple of advanced users. We'll just wait a couple more seconds. We've got about 80% in. And all right, we're going to go ahead and show you the responses real quick. And there you go. So it pretty much spans the gamut, and that's really important for Norm and I. So we'll be able to talk for the people who are beginner users of PowerPoint and those who are fairly comfortable and can use a lot of the advanced features. Okay. So let me just take a moment to go back to my screen. All right, and we'll move on. So what will you need to use this software? We're going to talk about the software and then the hardware. You're going to go to turningtechnologies.com, and that's where you're going to download the Turning Point software, version 5.3. They come out with new versions every 6 months to a year. So if you look at this icon here in this big graphic, in the center and the bottom, you'll see that Turning Point icon, and it says Turning Point by Turning Technologies. That's an actual interactive space. So if you click on that, it'll allow you to check for software updates. So once you download the software, you'll have the icon in the upper left-hand side on your desktop. When you double-click that, this dashboard is what you're going to see when it comes up. So this is your home base right here. What I want to point out on this one, since we're going to spend most of this presentation talking about PowerPoint polling, is these 3 panes here are actually 3 different programs. So we have PowerPoint polling, Anywhere polling, and also self-paced polling. So for the purposes of this webinar, and actually most of how we've been using Turning Point is in PowerPoint polling. As Norm mentioned earlier, we're going to talk briefly about Anywhere polling just to introduce the concept to you, and to those of you who use other applications for a lot of your presentations other than PowerPoint. But we're not going to go into the self-paced polling at all. It requires different hardware and something that we currently don't own or interact with. That's more for self-paced tests in higher education. So, moving on, what kind of hardware do you guys need? We have 2 different things. We have the receiver and the response card. So in every Turning Point kit, it'll come with 1 receiver that you see in the top right. It looks like a USB drive, and it comes with 30 clickers. And so these response cards or clickers are together in the kit with the receiver. A little bit about the receiver. It plugs into your computer from which you're giving your presentation. It has a range of 200 feet between that and the responders. And it can handle, one receiver can handle up to 1,000 clickers. So currently NCAT has 7 different kits. They're dispersed among some of the different regional offices, being sent back and forth pretty frequently in the past year with different Energy Corps members giving presentations around the country. And so We have a total of 210 clickers, so you can use all of those clickers on one receiver for a presentation if you had an audience that big. But usually the kits are sent, 30 at a time, but we can send a kit to you or 2 kits if you have a larger audience. So that's a little bit about the hardware and software, and we will now go on and talk a little bit about the benefits. So Norm touched on a lot of these already, and these are the 4 different concepts and 4 benefits that we want all of you to be thinking about as we go through the different questions that you can create and thinking about the presentations that you give. So Norm talked about understanding who's in your audience. It's common to ask a lot of demographic questions right up front so you can see exactly who's there, and then later you can actually use that to see how different demographic audience members answered different questions in your presentation. So that's really useful to you as a presenter. Norm touched on the Agile Learning, two-way learning. You're not just talking at your audience and presenting them information. They're able to give you immediate feedback, so it becomes a two-way street. Gauging audience knowledge. So before, during, and after, you can ask them content-based questions at the very front end of your presentation to see who knows what about what you're about to teach, and that can give you feedback on how to present the information and how much time to spend on different parts. You can ask them during to see if they're actually getting the concepts and understanding what you're trying to say. And then there's different ways to ask questions at the very end to measure the change in learning and the whole presentation, and some takeaways and reinforce different concepts that you're trying to get through to them. Towards the end of the presentation, Norm's going to talk a little bit more about evaluation data and how you can use all of the questions and the results that you have to then for performance measures and different types of evaluation criteria that we all have for different grants. So keep those benefits in mind, and now we're going to talk a little bit about different question types. So all of the question types you see listed on the left, from icebreaker on down to picture slides, we're going to talk about each one of those, how to use them and how to create those slides. And then the graphic you see on the right, that's going to be a list, and you'll see some of these question types in there. But the ones that we're not going to talk about are short answer, numeric response, essay. Those are some of the ones with a new product of Turning Point where they actually give you slide-out keyboard, so you can actually type in a text response. That's not something that we have or we're going to focus on at all today. All the questions on the left that you see can be answered by just clicking one button on one of those response cards. So we're going to get right into it and talk about different icebreaker questions. So Turning Point has developed 2 icebreakers that they've built in and they provided for you. So if you click on Analogy or Word Scramble, the graphic you see will self-populate and they'll create the questions for you. So this gives you an opportunity at the beginning of the presentation to establish a level of comfort between the presenter and the audience of how to actually click the button and see that their answers are received by you, and also you can start to work on your verbal guidance of the audience members of how quickly you want them to respond, and showing them when you're asking, when you want them to respond, and actually sharing their results with you. I want to point out just quickly, there's a rectangle in the bottom left-hand corner of that slide. It says Slide Preferences. It's minimized right now, but this Slide Preferences bar is going to be on every Turning Point slide when you create it. This will allow you to manipulate the question, some of the responses, and how it's presented. And I'll show you in a couple slides when it's in its expanded view and what different options you have there. So if you don't like those 2 options for an icebreaker that Turning Point gives you, you can create your own. And so it can be anything, that the presenter feels comfortable talking about, and just to, establish this communication between you and the audience and how to use it. This is where you can make sure to tell them that if they make a mistake and click on an answer that they didn't want to enter, they have the opportunity to change it, so they can change it as many times as they want while you're on that slide and polling is open. It will register the last response that they click. So that's important to tell them. So we're going to move right on to talk about a multiple choice question. So this is a multiple choice question. It's also a demographic question, and I pulled this right from an Energy Corps presentation where they're talking about energy conservation in the home and things you can do. So a lot of those different activities and things that they can do are going to be dependent on what type of home they live in. So that's really useful information. They've also made it a point to point out the clickers, since this is one of the first question they've asked, and put a red box around the buttons that they're going to be using in the presentation. So that's really helpful. This is just a slide of some additional demographic features that you can ask, different questions. There's lots of different ones you can do. It's going to be dependent on the presenter and what you want to get out of your audience early on. But here are some examples. I think the bottom one is from Dale's presentation 2 weeks ago for an energy code presentation. So the next two slides, I'm just going to talk about how to create a slide, and we'll just keep focusing on this demographic question since we're in it, and then we'll show you what it looks like when you're actually in presentation mode, running it, and what the audience sees and what you see as a presenter during the presentation. So when you open the software and you're in that home page and launch Turning Point, you'll see up here all of these different toolbars. Home, insert, design, animation, and so on. All of those are exactly what you see in a PowerPoint presentation. The only difference is the Turning Point toolbar that we're in now. So the Turning Point toolbar has all of these tools and features which allow you to create your question and manipulate how people see what you're presenting and the interaction between you and the audience. So we're going to spend a bit of time now talking about when you're creating a slide, you're in the Turning Point toolbar, and you're going to focus all the way on the left-hand slide where it says New. This is the first thing you'll do. When you click New, you'll see that drop-down menu of different types of question slides, multiple choice, true, false, etc. So if you clicked on Demographic Assignment and you want to continue and create your first demographic slide, you'll see the slide pop up, enter question text, enter answer, etc. And so from here, there are only 3 steps left before you're totally done creating a Turning Point slide. You're going to click on the enter question text, which will allow you to type in. Let's say we're going to ask a question, what is your age, to the audience. So at this point, you would just type in what is your age. Then you click on enter answer text, and then you enter in your different ranges. And once you can enter into 10 different answers. And so each clicker has numbers 1 through 0, or 1 through 9 and 0. 0 essentially acts as 10. And then the only other thing you have to do is click outside that box. So click anywhere else on your screen in Turning Point, and then you are ready to go. Your answer is ready and it's complete. So now we're just going to show you real quick what it's going to look like in presentation mode if you were to create that question and then it was, let's let it go. There you go. So say you're running your presentation, this is the question you created, and you come upon this slide. You're going to notice, I want to point out this toolbar here, and this is going to indicate to you as a presenter that this is a Turning Point slide and you're now collecting data from your audience. So then you let your audience know polling is open, and you'll see that because it'll come up green. And this is when you actually tell people to click on their clickers and choose their answer. Now right to the left of that green box, you'll see responses. So you'll see how many people in real time are answering your question. And so if this is the very first question you have and you have a larger audience, this is where you should make a mental note of approximately how many people are in the room and responding. You might have a couple that are late in responding, and it'll also give you an opportunity at this point before you're collecting real data to guide them and decide how long you're going to wait before everyone comes in. And that's depending on how comfortable the presenter feels. And you do a couple of these presentations and you say, all right, we're just waiting for 3 more to come in and we're going to close it up and move on, because you don't want to distract from your presentation and take too long. So once you do that, and you advance your slide just by a click, just like you would in a PowerPoint presentation to move forward, it'll close polling, which you'll see here now it's in red. You'll see that all your responses are locked in, and then it'll present your actual responses. So then that gives you information as a presenter as to who's in your audience, and it also lets everyone in the audience see who their peers are. And that gives you immediate information, so you can then cater your presentation and the information you're presenting to who's actually in the room with you. So now I'll turn it back to Norm, who's going to provide a little bit more detail on some of these questions and creating different slides.
Thank you, Kaleena. I like to take it from real-world examples on programs I've done, so I'm going to share some of those with you now. And this happens to come from a workshop I was at with Mike Morris down in Carolina Farm Stewardship this past November, and I've been asked to speak about, the topic was backyard poultry and beyond. They had a mixed audience, and they said, we don't know, it's one of these big conferences, over 1,000 people attend. You're going to be concomitant sessions going on, maybe 6 or 7 different workshops at the same time, and people just get up and move and walk in, and you don't know who you're getting. It's not a captive audience in that sense. We're not going to do a whole lot of recruiting. And I said, well, I really kind of like to know your audience. And so one of the things that always tells you up front is rethink your question. Think about who you're presenting to and who your group might be. And this comes as a yes or no question, but it doesn't have 2 simple answers. So the first thing I wanted to know, this gets to demographics. Did they or did they not raise meat birds, okay? And what type of birds did they have? Did they have layers? Did they have layers and meat birds? Did they have a breeder flock? Were they just a breeder? Or, were the people in the audience, gee, I've never raised chickens and I just came because I thought it was a neat topic. And when you go in blind into one of these things, it's kind of good to have that kind of a question being asked. I think in the audience I had 30 at the time. And what was interesting is I had nobody, and you can see here, I had nobody that just raised meat birds alone. There were people that layers and meat birds. I threw my own question in there in a breeder flock. I knew I was a breeder. Okay, and then 40% of the audience, lo and behold, had never raised chickens before. So I had all different levels, a real mixed bag, and that kind of threw me to a point where, as an Agile teacher, now I have to go back and make sure, I've got to cover some basics, but then, they also had some experienced producers, and I've got to give them a little something that they're going to want to stay in the room with. And so it kind of told me who I'm speaking to. Now let's go to the next slide. And this is one that came from a workshop that Chris Lent and I had done back, I think this is the Valentine's Day workshop that we did with a conservation district. And this was a group, you can see the audience had 60 producers in it. This was a traditional group of farmers that, spray and plant GMO crops. And we'd been asked to come in and speak about organic production. And the nice thing was we actually got a pesticide credit for doing this. But the question I wanted to do is I gave a presentation on organics, the value of organics, and the slide before this, a couple of slides I talked about was the profit margin right now. It was a time when the grain prices had just bottomed out. Organic prices for organic grains are still pretty high. And so my query after I'd done my presentation was, what's keeping you from being an organic grower? Okay, and so not enough profit. Well, we had already talked about that. Next one was certification takes time, and what I was really looking for were the people that would respond to C, D, and E. Ones that needed technical help. They hadn't thrown the baby out with the bathwater, but they were looking for some type of an assistance. And there was no cost share. Well, actually, most of us know that there is USDA cost share money out there within our CS. And the ones that needed more information. So, that 18.2 and 6% group that were there, those are the ones I'm really kind of wanting to reach out to. And, if you had a display at the conference, maybe they would approach you later. But again, it gives you kind of an idea of who is out in the audience and a multiple choice question that gets to some demographic information. So let's go to the next slide. And this is one that comes from Energy Corps. This is another true and false one instead of yes and no or multiple choice. And the Energy Corps member had been teaching energy use by different appliances. And the question or the information was about energy use in clothes washing, a clothes washer. And the nice thing is the question is 50% of the energy used just to heat the water? And the obvious answer, you can actually see a smiley face, and we're going to come back to this a little bit later, but that smiley face is the correct answer indicator. And so 78% of the audience said it was false, 50% of the energy was not used, and then down below you can see the 90%. There is the right answer also in text. So 90% of the energy in clothes washing is spent on heating the water. So there's the correct answer. Now if we go on to the next slide, another yes and no. Have you ever grown certified organic crops? And literally the way that popped up, the answer is what also happens on your screen, as Kaleena pointed out earlier, is that when the polling is closed, the answers pop up and everybody gets to see it. And that's kind of neat, and it draws people into the presentation. I put in a third, you're saying yes and no, Norm, there's only two answers there. Well, I put up the third one because there's always people that kind of hedge the bet. And if you give them a chance to respond, they'll still respond. And in this case, it was three people in that audience out of that group no, I don't want to answer yes or no, but I've got questions. Again, this may be an audience we need to speak to, those few numbers that are out there. And now I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to Kaleena.
Great, thanks, Norm. So we're going to talk about another type of question called priority ranking. Again, if you see in the left-hand graphic, if you select new and you have your question options here, we talked about multiple choice, we went over true, false, demographics, and the next one is priority ranking. So priority ranking slide is essentially a multiple choice question where they can not only select multiple answers, but the answer or the in which order that they enter their answers is going to actually create a ranking. So the question we have here of what your top 3 favorite holidays are, you would tell your audience that rank them, and so put your very top one in first. And then you can assign different weights, and that'll give you some information on how you would talk about some topics. So on the next slide, I'll just show you another priority ranking question, and this one is more relevant to NCAT of what you would like to learn about. Say you're giving a presentation on renewables and you only have so much time to cover a lot of different topics, and you really want to know how your audience prioritizes different energies. So you would ask them to select their top 3 or 4 or whatever you would like, and have them answer in that context. So I want to take this time to just talk about the slide preferences box. So this blue box you see on the right-hand slide that I just referenced earlier, this allows you to change a couple things. You have question options, polling options, and you also have another preference type called scoring. So for a priority ranking one, you just see question options and polling. So this allows you to increase or decrease your response limit based on what you want, and also you can create different weights for your responses. The polling options, it says you can show results and automatically open polling. So there might be a circumstance where you're asking a content-based question to see how much people know, but you don't want to show the results because maybe then you'll talk about it some more, ask the question again, and that would be the time you'd share the results with everyone. So there's a lot you can do to kind of cater it to your audience in your presentation. Now Norm's going to talk a little bit about picture slides.
Okay, you've all heard the saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words, and about halfway through this presentation, I'm wishing I had more pictures. But here's one that Dale used at his recent workshop that he had for a lot of energy engineers and installers and code enforcement people and things like that. And I look at picture slides for 2 reasons. One is if you want to do a comparison between right and wrong or good and bad. And the question here, you can see in the picture on the A side, we've got some insulation and ductwork, and at the very top, the insulation does not cover some of that yellow kind of fuzzy foam there. It's not completely enclosed. And then the B side, you can see on the other side, the silver insulation covering goes all the way up, and that does a nice job of covering it. And so there we're at the point where which is right, which is wrong. And the obviously answer is B is the correct finish. So a right and wrong picture, comparison picture is one way to ask that. And you can open up the dialogue with your audience. Well, let's talk about this. What's wrong with picture A, okay? Is obviously junk and dirt and moisture can get in there. Now we've ruined the insulation value. There may be a fire hazard or something like that happening. Let's go on to the next picture. In this one, this is one I happen to use a lot with people that do any type of gardening, lawn care, and we talk about our organic standards and especially about our organic database program. And I often talk about people's practices, and I say, well, what's wrong with this picture? And you could have people actually give them a choice. I didn't put a question slide in here to get a response, but it shows a picture of a young lady there, with shorts and sandals on. She's got a spray canister, and maybe somebody say, well, she's spraying. Well, I didn't qualify the question with what she was spraying. And so if we think about it as being, some type of a chemical or whatever, let's go on to the next slide. providing the answer in a graphic form. She's got bare feet and sandals there, so whatever's being sprayed on the turf grass there, obviously there's going to be contact as she walks through it or steps through it. The other bigger issue is that she's spraying right next to a wellhead, and if you talk about some of the wellhead characteristics, and almost every material that we have out there says do not apply anywhere near a well field or a wellhead. So, and the EPA setback is 50 feet. So, there's two things wrong. One answer is environmentally, and one is exposure issues. So, you can always want to test your question also. So there may be more than one right answer is what this slide shows. Now, Kaleena is going to go back and talk about some of the additional objects and neat things we can do with Turning Point.
Thanks, Norm. So the additional objects are things that you can add in to give your audience more visuals or help them, reinforce which one is correct, but they're additional. So everything we've talked about so far in terms of creating question types and how to create the question and what it looks like, if you are on the end of, wanting to keep it simple, that's all you have to do. But we're just going to touch briefly on a countdown timer, correct answer indicator, and a response grid. You can see a couple different options for the countdown timer, just depending on your preference. And we're just going to go right into how to insert these into your presentation. So this is just a screenshot of creating a question. Again, we're in the Turning Point ribbon up there, and all the way on the left, if you click New, that's where you create your question. Once you've done that, the one directly to the right of that is Objects, and so that's where the timer, indicator, and the response grid are all housed. So if we were to select Countdown, and then in this case we're going to select Clock, and then you'll see that graphic pop right up on the bottom right. And then you can increase or decrease the time, whatever you want, and also when you're running it, that'll be how many seconds your audience has to answer the question. So it'll help guide them along to answer quickly so you can move on. That being said, if you had 10-15 seconds left on the timer and everyone has already answered in, you can just click and advance and close polling immediately so you don't have to wait for that. So moving on to the correct answer indicator. Again, it's housed in the same place, this Objects tool, and then it's the very first one, correct answer indicator, and you can see there are options there: smiley face, star, check mark. You can even do a custom one and bring in your own graphic to indicate. The only caveat here with using this indicator is, again, in the slide preferences bar off on the right where you see all the red and green, you have to indicate that one of your questions is designated as the correct one. Once you do that, you can insert your indicator and it'll pop up to just send a visual message to your audience of what the correct answer is. So the last additional object we're going to talk about today is the response grid. So here's the response grid, again in the same place: Objects, go down to Grids, and then click Response. So this small little gray and checkered response icon is what you'll see pop up. And then I'll just show you when you're in presentation mode, this is what you'll see. You'll have a grid pop up. You can move it anywhere you like. And right now you see numbers in there, and that just indicates how many audience members you have. But on the back of every clicker, it has an identification number, a series of numbers and letters. So you can actually have it present itself as that in the response grid. So each of those, the rectangles will change colors when people respond. So you can say, hey, look on the back of your clicker, we're waiting for one more attendee to respond. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit, and Norm is going to go into game theory and talk about how that interfaces with Turning Point.
This is just one example of you take the countdown timer. Kaleena was saying you can count down at 30 seconds. I usually start at about 20, and what I do with my countdown timer, if you really want to make people answer quickly, is go into gaming mode. Game theory really makes learning competitive, but it enhances, your neural activity. People really start paying attention because now competition comes in. I may win or lose at something, and there may be a value here at the end just beyond knowledge itself, and it really kind of plays to people's inside, but that's not bad. All's fair in love and war and learning theory, I think. And what we do with this one is essentially takes that response grid, and when game, you can do a bunch of things. You can split an audience in half, one side of the room against the other, and play teams off. If it doesn't take a lot, oftentimes if you're the player right before lunch and you've got a big audience sitting there anyhow, and then they're all in one room, is whoever wins gets to go to lunch first. They get to go through the buffet line. That can be real low-hanging, simple, competition. Is the other team that didn't do as well gets to sit and wait before they eat. Another thing I've done sometimes, and this shows the fastest responder. Oftentimes the audience will respond in, and Kaleena said you can put this up in the gaming pull down that's on that menu bar, and you can ask who's the fastest correct responder. And what I've done at some workshops is I actually might go in and I've done this with if I'm doing soils, I may have a free soil test kit for somebody. The fastest person that got the question right on pH, and it happens to be at 22.42 seconds was participant. You flip them, tell them to look on the backside. Oh, you want a free soil test, ma'am? Or, we have this nice book on backyard poultry, sir. And I've done that at workshops, and all of a sudden now the attention really increases. And so you have that opportunity to do some of that. If we go to the next slide, Turning Point itself offers, this is kind of a pull-down menu or list, and it's on the Turning Point, Turning Technologies website. The things you really need to do to kind of pull everything together. If you have this technology, you have PowerPoint, you've written your questions, or if somebody else has developed one and you just want to use it, there's no sense reinventing the wheel. And hey, I saw this presentation that one of the Energy Corps members did. I really thought it was great. Can you send me your presentation? I've got the kit right here. And what you want to do is you need is just plug in your receiver, launch it, and that usually means when you go to a conference, if you got Turning Point software, you're not going to want to use the conference's computers or laptops. The other reason is you want to save that data. You want to save it onto your computer. So if it becomes an issue, you may often want to say, well, I need a couple of extra minutes to set up. I'm going to unplug from the projector. I'm going to use mine. Okay. Look at the connections. I don't think we use participant lists a lot. It's used a lot in classrooms where people keep coming again and again sequentially, and you're doing some quizzing or credits or something like that. Select your PowerPoint polling, open the presentation up, and you're ready to go. And then the last couple of points that really become critical is saving the session. 9 and 10. And let's go to that next part because that's the part we're going to finish out on here is how do we use Turning Point to save the data. Okay, when the data is collected from your Turning Point session, one of the things you want to remember, let's go ahead and click, is it will save this in an Excel format. And that's the neat thing is it gets to generate the presentation data, the graphs in a spreadsheet and tables, and I'm going to share some of that with you. And then you can start comparing your demographics. Let's say we had non-producers and producers, or we had organic producers and non-organic, or people by different age groups. So we start looking at some of that information and where's that going. If we go ahead and look at the next slide, always be sure to save your data is one of the issues. And on the toolbar, you'll see the arrow comes down there, and it will actually say, in terms of that, you want to title it. This especially becomes true if you've got an Energy Corps program or you've got a Food Corps and you're doing multiple presentations. And you're going to do this maybe 5 or 6 times, okay? And you're presenting to the 5th grade classes in one school district. You're going to want to title that slide by the teacher's name, or if you're going to different sites, you may want to do it by the name of the school or the location, and so you can save multiples to that folder that you're saving all your data in. And then the nice thing is if you're reporting that back to the program manager, or you're saving that for your report to your RMA project, your impacts, and you're doing this a number of times, you now have all that data collected in one folder, and now you can actually sort through that. If we go to the next slide, one of the things you can see here is I've actually saved a screenshot. The pie graph on the right-hand side is one of the ways it saves it, and then, of course, in the tabular form is the other one. And so we look at the demographics, and in this question was from a presentation that I did several weeks back, and it was to dairy farmers in the audience, and it was from a large vet practice, and they asked me to speak about nuisance bird control and salmonella outbreaks on farms. And so one of my questions I had was, are birds a problem on your farm? And 81% of the audience said yes, 7% said no, and I always gave them out as, and this may be very true, especially with nuisance bird issues, is, 11% of them said no, but my neighbor has the problem and it's coming over to my place. So, and what was interesting about that is in the audience, I probably should ask one more question, was I had farmers and veterinarians. And the question when I gauged the farmers, was it a bad problem? Not really. And the vets in the audience literally came out of their chairs before I could even put the next slide up and ask the vets that question, is they said, you guys got a heck of a problem because we have to report it every time there's an outbreak of salmonella. With that kind of gets me to my next slide. Let's talk about another graphic slide here. And what we have here is an example from a Turning Point presentation that I did with a garden center. Well, not a garden center. It was with a group of master gardeners and community garden program, and that was done last year. And the question I got to was, I'd done a presentation on organic gardening methods and, how to reduce chemicals. And the question I had on these vegetable gardeners and community gardeners was, I wanted to get to the end, and it was a food security. I kind of wanted to walk, maybe to the side of how many of you folks, you grow these fresh produce that's out there, how many of you actually can it or freeze it, and the demographic question was there. And the nice thing was I only had 20 people in the audience, but probably 2/3 of them said yes, they canned or froze their produce. So that got me to the question of, there are strengths and values in the questions that you ask in terms of that. And you can look at that and say, well, now I've got a food security, answer to a presentation that I did. And maybe that wasn't the original outcome, but I can share that and say that, in this community, 2/3 of the community gardeners were actually getting to food security issues. Now we're going to go back and turn it over to Kaleena, and she's going to talk about some of these other platforms.
So what if I don't use PowerPoint or don't use it often when I'm presenting? In the very first question that we asked you earlier, no one said, no, I don't use PowerPoint. So that answers that question on this call. But there might be opportunities where you're going to create a presentation or save your PowerPoint in an Adobe format and present it that way, or you're going to just go through different websites to talk about different issues. So we just want to introduce the concept of anywhere polling and how that can be how you can use that outside this concept of talking about a PowerPoint presentation. So we showed you this dashboard early on, and we were focusing on the PowerPoint polling. So this is the anywhere polling in the center of your screen. So if you click on that in the dashboard, you will see this box pop up where the arrow is pointing to. And essentially, this box is your control center for anywhere polling, and it combines all of the Turning Point controls you have in PowerPoint that we went through, and also the control you have when you're running the presentation and opening and closing polling. So it may sound a little confusing, but essentially I'm just going to show you two examples. One here of just going to the NCAT website, and say you were talking and introducing folks to what NCAT was and where we were located. So you see all the different regional offices listed, and you decide, what, I'd like to really know at this national conference where everyone is located and how close they are to some of our offices. So you would say verbally to your audience, all right, here's a question, get your clickers ready. Which office are you located closest to of these options? Now you would have to verbally explain to them that A would be Butte, B would be Fayetteville, C Jackson, and so on. And then you would click on this green and white play button, and that would open polling. You would, again, to the right of that, see the responses coming in, and then you click to close polling, and then what will pop up is a graph showing your responses. So it allows you to poll over any application. Here's just another example of a Word document, and say you have a survey that's already created, and you wanted to poll people on that survey without handing out all the papers and then collecting them. So you would open Anywhere Polling, you have that toolbar come up, and again you can move it anywhere you want, and then open polling and ask your question. So it's a little bit different format. You're going to have to verbally explain, A, B, C, and D, or 1, 2, 3, and what answers are linked to which ones. But the nice thing about Anywhere Polling, once you run a presentation and then you save it afterwards, the software will take a screenshot every time you open polling and close it, so you can see which questions you asked and visually what your audience was seeing. So that'll help you if you're asking questions on the fly and don't remember exactly what you were asking. So just to summarize quickly, Anywhere Polling allows you to poll over any application. You don't have to create it ahead of time within PowerPoint, and you can ask questions on the fly. You can also prepare a question list ahead of time if you're going to poll over other applications and do it that way. And on the right, you see that control bar with the green and white play button. Below it is what will pop up after you close polling and share your answers with everyone. Again, you're going to have to let them know what those answer options are. And on the left, I'm not going to go through all those different features, but it does have a lot of control in that small area. So at this time, quickly, I'm just going to bring up another poll for everyone to ask everyone on this webinar how you feel about Anywhere Polling and if you have any interest in learning more about it. So go ahead and select your answer, and we'll see people have started to respond, and we'll just kind of see where everyone's at. And it's pretty much all over. People are focused on PowerPoint polling. Some are pretty interested in Anywhere, and some need a little more time to think about it. We'll wait a couple more seconds. We've got about 75% of the votes in now. Just give it a little more time and then share with you the results. Okay, so it goes across the board. And we can talk to you more about that, after this webinar and talk more about Anywhere Polling and what it does. But for now, we're going to go back and we're going to talk about who should use this. So, who should use Turning Point? Presenters, audience members, what does it look like? And our answer, as you can imagine, is everyone. If you can construct a PowerPoint slide, as simple or as complex as you want it to be, you have the skills to create a Turning Point slide and effectively run a presentation. You can really scale it up or scale it down depending on your level of comfort and time and how much you want to put into it. As far as audience members goes, everyone. So Energy Corps members have been giving presentations over the last year and a half to all ages. They've gone into elementary schools, and that's where some of the picture slides might come into use with presenting picture answers as opposed to text if they can't read. And they've gone into senior citizen centers and presented to some older folks as well that may not be as familiar with technology or video games or have any kind of prior knowledge of using these response cards. So the whole thing. One little thing I'll say about the senior citizen presentation, just because an Energy Corps member shared it with us, that they weren't able to see the buttons very clearly. And so that's just something to take into consideration with your audience and being able to explain it really well on the front end and maybe create really simple questions where they only have to click true or false or only use the first 3 buttons and then show them exactly where it is. So you might need to do a little bit of extra work on that end. And then second grade classes, city officials, they've presented to different civic groups. It just works in every situation. And quickly we'll just talk about NCAT staff members and Energy Corps member plug of their experience with it. I chose not to put up any of the software or technical issues they've encountered. We'll talk about that on the next slide. But Dale used Turning Point about 2 weeks ago for the first time, and he presented to maybe 80 different code officials in a particular presentation. I think he ran 2 presentations. So he had a good experience with it, so you can be sure that I wanted to get a plug from him immediately to share it with you folks. And he does acknowledge, yes, it takes a little more effort, but it's worth it. Everyone enjoyed it, and it builds in interaction and interest. So moving on, our Energy Corps members have been using this in 5 different states over the past a little bit more than a year. And so these are just some of the quotes coming from them. And I'd like to just take this brief opportunity to thank them for paving the road with Turning Point and using it. It's really not easy to add the learning curve of Turning Point to your plate when you've got 11 months of service to complete a heavy workload. And so they've survived a couple technical glitches, software compatibility issues, and a couple other things that they've worked through in a short amount of time and given us really good feedback about using it and what people need to know. So I really appreciate them taking the bull by the horns and using this during their service to collect really important information and performance measurement data for our program. So I'm going to turn it back over to Norm to close us out and give us a summary and some takeaway points.
Okay, thank you, Kaleena. Kind of in summary, what we're looking at here is a system that really engages the learner. That's one thing that PowerPoint does well. Instead of being a dry topic, now all of a sudden people start interacting with content, okay? And so it becomes a strong motivator, even more so when you start looking at game theory. And I've used this with audiences that are even technologically, you kind of wonder. I use it with Mennonite communities that don't use a lot of television, graphics, computers, anything like that, and I was really worried about using it with them, and they jumped in because they play lots of games, board games and things like that, and so gaming to them was very logical, and really heightened it up, and they became very curious about it. It provides anonymity. We talked about that. The anonymity is a real key factor because there's a lot of minority opinions that are out there, and oftentimes they get discounted or they're not included, and especially if you're gathering practices by communities of farmers or growers or ranchers, whatever it may be. You're often surprised by the depth of what's going on out there, and it's only by the quality of the question that you ask, which brings out another point again, is that you really want to test your questions. Oftentimes we think we know what we're asking, but if you run it by or practice it or run it by somebody else at the office or on your team, have them check the question, and it never hurts to refine the question a little bit. It provides discussion points. It facilitates discussion because, especially if you have a good or a bad picture, there's a good example of one there where you can talk about this worked and why this didn't work, and so you have this two-way going on, and that really increases, again, memory and retention and what the audience learned. Provides immediate feedback, not only that, but immediate data, both of those things. That immediate feedback keeps people involved rather than they go away and, I have to think about this a little bit. It provides you, the teacher, also, gee, did they really get what I was trying to explain to them? And the last thing is it reduces time spent on evaluation. Usually if you had to go back and collect data after you did your workshops, and especially if you're dealing with funders or projects, you have that data right there when you leave that presentation or classroom. You save it, you got it, it's now in a format that you can use it at, and it becomes very valuable. To the point that even our major funders now, I think the last time we did RMA grants, was that they actually mentioned Turning Point technology as being a legitimate evaluation tool, actually in the proposal itself. And you can actually go back now and tell people, and really raises the impact of what we did. Oftentimes, I think as educators, a lot of us have assumptions that we have, or we think things are happening, and this really takes it out of that assumptive phase and actually puts it back in factual data, and you can't argue with data and statistics and numbers once you've got them loaded. The last slide we have, we want to turn you over to some resource information that's out there. Turning Technologies, and that's, like I said, the brand that we've invested in terms of NCAT, really has done an excellent job of resources that are out there. For example, they have pre-recorded videos and tutorials that are out there, and I was on yesterday looking for something, and they had 26 different recorded sessions on different topics that we talked about, whether it was gaming, whether it was demographic questions, and each one of those pre-recorded sessions is about 30 to 45 minutes. Okay, the beginner sessions that they have for first-timers run only about 30 minutes each. In addition, I think in the next 10 days, they have 7 online classes that you can sign up for. A lot of those are free, and what they'll ask you is, who are you? What organization are you? Did you buy our software? Not buy our software, buy our hardware. The software is free, and you can just go on and do that. And then I know Al's had the experience where they'll do one-on-one instruction with you when you get online. So a couple of other things that are there's a number of educational units, like you can see Yale University, University of Kentucky, Syracuse University and Indiana University of Pennsylvania that have websites that support clicker technology with examples of questions, things like that. And then I guess the last resource we have is in-house, is of course Kaleena and I. We're willing to spend time if anybody has questions on using the technology, to help other staff get more comfortable with it, to work them through that, to discuss it with them. If they're in the office, we can do that, or if we're out somewhere at another regional office, we're available. And then Al and I, especially when it comes to writing those questions, because regardless of what you're wanting to evaluate, the question really becomes the crux of are you asking the audience the right thing? And so I know Al and I are available to help you test questions, to run them by you. And with that, I think we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Kaleena and ask questions. She has one more for you.
Thanks, Norm. So some of you have already realized that I skipped question 2 and 3 accidentally at the beginning of the webinar, but this is the one that we want to focus on right now. What topics would you like to learn more about as far as Turning Point goes? So why don't you go ahead and answer so we can get a better sense of where people are at, and if anyone answers E, that they have nothing that they want to learn about, we'll assume that you are an expert and you can join our team in teaching other people how to use it. So we've got a 25% of the vote in so far. Some people are wanting to know how to download it and just get started, and other people are interested in game theory and some of the advanced features, so this is great. We'll just give it a couple more seconds for people to answer. And we'll go ahead and share it with you guys. Okay, and that looks great. I mean, that'll be a great jumping off point for us to work with you guys individually and talk about how to get started and use some of these other features within Turning Point. So before we go ahead and open it up and people can unmute themselves, I just wanted to talk about one question that did come in from Rex. And he mentioned that he heard the software can be used out in the field. It's not just restricted to the classroom. And so that would be great for field courses. So that is, I'm glad you asked that question and brought that up. I haven't, I guess, attended a training or interacted with people who have used it in that context, but here's the only thing that you need in order to run the current hardware and software that we have. You need that receiver, you need the clickers, and then you'll need a computer that you can actually put the receiver in to run it. So if you have a small laptop, and they're making them pretty small these days, you don't need an internet connection, and you can actually run it anywhere, outside or in the field. There's other software and other programs that Turning Point has, and they sell Turning Point has it. They sell the license to, where everything is wireless, and you can actually download apps on your smartphones and run it that way. We don't currently have that, but I'm kind of curious as to whether people more commonly use it in that sense, so they don't actually have to carry a small computer out there. And I don't know, Rex, if you wanted to comment or ask anything else about that aspect.
Well, one of our collaborators had suggested that she had heard for field courses, you could ask a question and the receiver actually goes into a data collector, or the receiver is a data collector, so you don't even need a computer out in the field. You can plug in this data collector into a USB port, and whatever questions you asked out in the field, you can kind of summarize them, or I'm not sure what the software. I'm assuming Turning Point has some more field friendly software, perhaps, or maybe some of the options that you had highlighted can be modified to use out in the field, and then you can have these sets of questions, and it could be about future practices. Are you going to do this or this or this? And because we do so many field courses or field-based trainings as opposed to just classroom, I would think, at least for us, that would be a really, really valuable component to have.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good point that we should definitely look more into.
Rex, this is Norm. I know that Turning Technologies has an entire Mac series that would support, I guess the smallest module I can think of would be an iPad as a receiver, okay? And the nice thing is on that one even, on some of the clickers, not the ones that we currently have in our shop, but they do make a receiver unit that even contains the entire program, so you can upload your program onto that USB receiver and then store data back into that USB receiver. You still would need to run it through something small like a pad, you know. But that's the most in-field application I've seen of that. You know, and you can ask the question, query the audience, but you need to run that through some type of a USB port system. So good question.
Thanks.
Questions that anyone has at this time?
This is Margot. Once you create like a set of questions, are those slides able to be like easily like copied and pasted into another presentation, so you don't have to create the same slides each time if you're asking the same questions?
Yes.
Okay.
I guess here's one important factor when you're creating your presentation or creating the Turning Point slides for the first time. It's really important to open up the Turning Point software first, and then when you're in there, you can bring in an existing PowerPoint presentation. So whether you bring in a PowerPoint at that time or you're creating your new PowerPoint for the first time and then create your slides, you can copy and paste them. But just be wary that if you're copying and pasting to a different presentation, when you're in that your further presentations down, make sure you're still in Turning Point, because if you copy and paste Turning Point slides when you're just in PowerPoint, it won't have that interactive feature. It'll just be a snapshot or a slideshot of just a picture. You won't be able to change the questions or edit any slide preferences. But absolutely, and when you save that presentation, it'll save as a PowerPoint, so you can open it up and look at it at other times.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Other questions or even any other comments or how people feel about downloading the software this afternoon and hitting the ground running? Or maybe I'll pick on Dave Scott if he's still in the room and he can talk about how easy it was to use this for the first time yesterday.
Well, it's not that hard, and I'm very beginning at it, so especially when you have somebody telling you what to do. But it's pretty easy in terms of just 5 or 6 steps to go through, and you're on it. And I think it's doable.
Thanks, Dave.
Albuquerque, just a couple of things. If folks have feedback on this session, why don't you send it to, well, you could send it to me, I suppose, or send it to Kaleena and Norm saying, here's what, we should have done differently, because there's another whole group of folks who aren't on this, which is Food Corps, NCAT staff and Food Corps members. So if you've got any feedback on the event itself, by all means do that. I'm in a spot where I'm curious as to whether there's instances where, particularly from Norm, if you've just said, Turning Point won't work as a pre-test or post-test, and under what circumstances you just said, well, I can't use it. It just, or is your use of this thing 100%?
Al, good question. Where it won't work is if you want any type of longitudinal data. I mean, that's pretty obvious. You did a program, you did a workshop, and then we want to track, long-term behavior 4 or 6 months out. Obviously not the tool you'd want to use. You might want to, if you develop that survey, to go back or, do a phone survey or, a written one, or, you can do a polling device, by computer. That may be so, but that's probably the one time I would not use it. The whole value really lies in what do you want folks, it makes you rethink your programs, I guess is what I'm saying, is what do you really want people to come away from? What do you want them to learn? What are those 2 or 3 points? The other tool I would use it for, and that's an evaluation thing. The other one that works well, and I don't think we often think much about it, is when we're trying to gauge current practices within a community or a group, okay? And you're talking to a group of producers or, a group of senior citizens, what are they doing, and why are they doing that? Because as educators and trainers, we always come at things with assumptions, and oftentimes, taking those assumptions aside and saying, well, 25% of the audience was doing something we never expected. So unintended outcomes are another good side benefit that we often, kind of dismiss. Maybe it's because we have our pre-thought assumptions that are out there. So, but yeah, other than that, I don't see a lot of places where it shouldn't be used. It's used a lot in residential settings, education, and like Rex says, is the flexibility with his question was, if you're out in a field day, can you use something like this? The size of the technology is the only limitation at this point, I think, quite honestly.
This is Dave again. Norma, could you talk a little bit, if you had any experience with audiences, farmer audiences, say, where perhaps your average age is over 60. Are they willing to use this? Did you get a good response?
Yeah, I use a little bit different icebreaker on that one, Dave. Can you go to mute? Yeah. What I do with that icebreaker, quite honestly, is I ask a question, what's your favorite color tractor? And all the old guys in the room are going to get blue, green, international red, whatever it may be. And so that gets to the issue of, I put it in a contextual thing where they enjoy that or not. The other thing is sometimes they get hesitant and will walk away, and I won't go on to the next slide, and I'll hold the entire room captive until I get the last couple of responses that I want to see, okay? And if you give them enough choices also that if they're the minority opinion, they can voice that.
Thank you, Norm.
Are any other questions? Go ahead and unmute yourselves.
Kaleena?
Yes?
This is Rex. I have a question. So do you have to create the whole PowerPoint within Turning Point, or I'm not quite clear on how that works.
You can open an existing or complete PowerPoint presentation within the software of Turning Point, and then just add in Turning Point slides on the spot. So you don't have to start from scratch.
Okay, thank you.
I'll chime in here a little bit. I think to reinforce what Kaleena said earlier is you need to open up in Turning Point and close out in Turning Point. But a lot of the presentations I've done in the past, I've essentially just lifted sections of PowerPoint presentations I've done in the past, insert them into the Turning Point format. And really, remember, all it is just one more ribbon on that toolbar on the top. And, that opens up your questions, that opens up, your timers, all those other little tricks that are on there, and then saving it back into that format. Once in a while, you may catch conflicts, especially in some of the older software, so you want to always go back and make sure you have the latest software that Turning Point has. And one of the issues with being quite progressive is they're updating software every couple of months, and Kaleena and I found that out, is we end up what they call legacy software. Yeah, that's old stuff, but it's out there and still being used. But I think that's part of the key out there to doing that, Rex. Good question.
Any last questions today? And thanks, Al, for bringing that up on getting feedback on the webinar. That'll be really helpful. Feedback loops are very important. If no one has any other questions, Norm, I don't know if you have any closing thoughts or want to close us out.
Yeah, I'd say try it. Be like the commercial. You might like it. Dale's comments, and not to pick on Dale, but he's one of our more senior staff members, and he's very interested in using technology, but he's also a very cautious individual, and there's somebody that used it and jumped in with both feet, and quite successful and very pleased with it. In summary, it's going to take a little time up front, But I think in the long run, you're going to be very happy once you master this, and you're going to come away with oh, gee, I can do this and I can do that, and now I've got to think a little bit better about, or a little harder about what I'm training to and things I'm asking of my audience. And I think it actually, in the end, makes us better trainers, educators, people that are out there sharing the message of sustainability and communities.
Thanks, Norm. Well, if no one has any other last thoughts, I'll just thank everyone for coming today and hope that you all got something out of this webinar, and we can continue this conversation after today and get more folks on board using it. So have a great day.